Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got a great collection of sources you shared on negotiation. Really interesting stuff,
Yeah, lots to unpack there.
for sure. And our aim, as always, is to kind of sift through it all, pull out those nuggets, those aha moments for you, without drowning you in theory.
Exactly. Cut through the noise a bit.
So negotiation, it's everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're all doing it all the time, maybe without even, labeling it as such.
Absolutely. From big deals down to who's loading the dishwasher tonight.
Right. It boils down to navigating these interests. Sometimes they align, sometimes they seem totally opposite.
And what's really fascinating looking at these sources is how it's this fundamental social interaction, but also a really complex skill. It taps into how we think, interact, our psychology, even our biology.
It's not just about the handshake at the end. It's this whole social dance trying to figure out those shared and unshared interests.
That's a good way to put it, a dance.
And that's really our mission for you in this deep dive. You want to get better at this, feel more effective. So we want to give you a clearer map, different approaches, key concepts, so you can feel more confident, more skilled in those conversations.
Makes sense. So where should we kick things off?
How about we start with the basics? The sources point to two sort of fundamental strategies that keep popping up.
Yes. Positional negotiation and interest-based negotiation. They're kind of the two big pillars, very different flavors.
Okay, let's tackle positional first. This feels like the classic image, right? Sort of head-to-head, maybe a bit adversarial.
Yeah, that's often how it's perceived. Your sources frame it as basically a zero-sum game.
Meaning like a fixed pie. If I get more, you automatically get less.
Precisely. Win-lose. My gain is your loss. It's very focused on claiming as much of that existing value as possible for yourself.
And the sources mention this is common in legal settings. Something about negotiation in the shadow of the law.
Exactly. When people are potentially facing court, their negotiation often mirrors what a judge might decide. Damages, who has to do what, injunctions. It's about dividing up that potential legal outcome, that pie.
Got it. So if you're playing this positional game, what are the typical moves I think the sources mentioned starting high?
Definitely. You open with a position that gives you room to make concessions later, like listing your old phone online for $150 when you'd actually be happy with $50.
Oh, okay. And that first offer, that $150, that's the anchor, right?
Yes, that's a key concept. The first number thrown out there has this huge psychological effect. It kind of sets the boundaries for the whole discussion, even if it's a bit arbitrary.
Anchor and adjustment trap. It pulls expectations towards that initial number.
It really does, which is why the sources stress doing your research before you make that first offer. You want a strong anchor, but, it needs to be credible.
And then it's the give and take, the concessions. But you don't just give ground randomly.
No, ideally you link your concessions to justifications. Makes you seem rational, not just like you're caving.
And withholding information, like maybe not mentioning you have a tight deadline.
Oh, absolutely. Information is power in this model. If they know you're desperate or under time pressure, well, they might just hold out for a better deal for themselves.
So the overall style's pretty competitive.
Very much so. Win-lose thinking dominates. Communication can get quite restricted. People would control information flow, maybe even distort things a bit.
Doesn't sound like a recipe for building great relationships.
Often it isn't. The sources mention things like obstructiveness, not being very helpful, even problems in team negotiations if everyone's just focused on their individual slice.
Tactics like keeping your cards close to your chest.
Yep. And that classic let's just split the difference move, which often isn't fair if the starting positions weren't equally reasonable.
One point the sources made that stood out was anchoring to your goal, not just your bottom line. What's the distinction there?
That's crucial. Your bottom line is your walkaway point, the absolute minimum you'll accept. But your goal is what you really want, your aspiration. Anchoring to that higher goal helps pull the final agreement up, rather than just settling near your minimum.
Okay, so positional negotiation sounds assertive, maybe even a bit aggressive sometimes. The sources say it has risks, but isn't totally useless.
Right. It gets a bad rap sometimes, and it can damage relationships or lead to stalemate if it's the only way you negotiate. But knowing these tactics, being able to claim value effectively, that's still an important skill. It's a tool in the toolbox.
Not the whole toolbox, though.
Definitely not, which brings us to the other main approach, interest-based negotiation.
Okay, so how does this one differ? It sounds more cooperative.
It is, generally. The fundamental shift is moving away from arguing over fixed positions, what people say they want, and digging down to understand the underlying interests, the needs, desires, fears, concerns that are driving those positions.
Ah, like the famous orange story the sources mentioned.
Exactly, the classic example. Two sisters, one orange. They argue, they compromise, they cut it in half. Positional thinking, right? Split the difference.
But that wasn't the best outcome.
Not at all. If they'd asked why each wanted the orange explored their interests, they'd find one sister needed the peel to make a cake and the other just wanted the juice to drink.
So they both could have gotten 100% of what they actually needed.
Precisely. By focusing on interests, they could have expanded the pie instead of just dividing it. It unlocks potential for win-win solutions that positional bargaining often completely misses.
That's a really powerful illustration. And the sources link this approach to building trust and really understanding each other.
Yes, because you have to share information about your interests and be genuinely curious about the other side's interests. It's inherently more collaborative.
So what are the key building blocks for this approach? Identifying interests seems like job one.
Absolutely foundational. But it's not always easy, right? People often state positions automatically. You have to actively probe, ask why.
The sources had that nice metaphor, the coral reef. The positions are just the tips sticking out of the water.
But the real action, the complex ecosystem, the underlying interests are all hidden beneath the surface. You have to be willing to dive down.
So lots of open-ended questions, really listening not just to what's said, but maybe what's not said.
Exactly that. Explore your own interests deeply first, then really work to understand theirs.
Okay, interests first. What's next? Alternatives.
Right. What happens if you don't reach an agreement? We often hear about BKNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, your plan B.
But the sources suggest going beyond just the best alternative.
Yeah, they introduce MLLATIA, the most likely alternative, and WATANA, the worst alternative. Thinking through that whole range gives you a much more realistic picture of your walkaway power and flexibility.
So it's less about a single, rigid bottom line and more about a spectrum of possibilities outside the negotiation.
Correct. And the goal in interest-based negotiation isn't just to beat your BATNA, but ideally to find a solution within the negotiation that's better for everyone than their alternatives. Creating new value, remember.
Which leads neatly into generating options.
Yes. And the key distinction the sources make is that options are potential solutions or pieces of solutions, not the final agreement itself.
Back to the orange. Cutting it in half was one option, but giving the peel to one and the juice to the other was a different option that met their interests better.
Perfect. And the crucial technique here is brainstorming, generating lots of possibilities without judging them initially.
Why separate generating from evaluating?
Because criticism kills creativity. You want a free flow of ideas first. Maybe some seem silly, but they might spark something useful. Get everything on the table, then start assessing.
And the sources also mention people are more likely to buy into solutions they helped create.
That's a huge psychological factor, ownership. If you co-create the solution, you're invested in making it work.
I think there was that example of the power companies Edison and Bonneville.
Right. Finding a really creative partnership that helped both with energy and environmental concerns like salmon runs, that's the kind of out-of-the-box thinking interest-based approaches can foster.
Okay, interests, alternatives, options. What's the last piece?
Independent criteria, or objective standards. These are external benchmarks of fairness you can use to evaluate the options.
Like market value, or scientific judgment, or legal precedent.
Exactly. Using these helps move the discussion away from a pure contest of wills, I want this because I want it, towards a more reasoned discussion about what's fair or practical based on external realities.
So the overall style here is much more cooperative, framing things as shared problems, trying to meet everyone's underlying needs.
And actively building rapport and good relationships. The idea is that a good relationship isn't just nice to have, it actually facilitates finding better solutions. Plus, those relationships can pay dividends in future negotiations, too.
But it's not a magic wand, is it? The sources mention risks. Like, what if the other side just wants to play hardball?
That's a real challenge. Interest-based negotiation works best when all parties are genuinely engaged in the process. If one side is purely positional and competitive, it can be difficult.
And you might reveal your interests, your why, and they could potentially use that against you if no deal is reached.
That's a potential vulnerability, yes. It requires judgment about how much to share, when, and assessing the trustworthiness of the other party. But the potential upside, finding those creative, mutually beneficial solutions, is often seen as worth the calculated risk.
Okay, so we have these two fundamental approaches, positional and interest-based. Now, the source has also brought in something called the constructive negotiation model. How does that fit in?
It's presented as a kind of integrated framework. It tries to weave together your negotiation style, the overall strategy you choose, like positional or interest-based or a mix, and the specific skills you deploy.
And it emphasizes the idea of the reflexive negotiator.
Yeah,
Sounds like being really self-aware.
exactly. It's about developing awareness on multiple levels. The social dynamics, the political context, the theories we're discussing, your own psychological triggers, even physiological responses like stress. Being mindful of all that is happening while you're negotiating.
Sounds intense, but helpful. This model also has stages, right?
Yes, four are typically mentioned. Relational positioning.
Which involves both competitive posturing and relationship building. So a mix right from the start.
Precisely. Then exploring issues and interests. That's the deep dive into information sharing. After that comes generating options, the brainstorming phase, and finally, reaching solutions, moving towards a decision.
And the key idea is that you're constantly doing this dance, as you called it earlier, between competitive and cooperative moves, between positional tactics and interest-based exploration throughout all these stages.
That's the core of the constructive model. It's not rigidly one thing or the other. It's about flexibility and adapting your approach based on the specific issue, the stage of the negotiation, and the behavior of the other party.
Okay, this is all incredibly helpful framework-wise. But none of it works if you just wing it, right? The sources hammer home the importance of preparation.
Oh, massively. It's probably the single most highlighted factor for success across all the materials.
And they even call out the common excuses, don't they? No time. This one isn't important enough. I don't know how.
Yeah, they tackle those head on. The message is clear. Preparation pays off hugely. It doesn't mean scripting every word, but it means thinking through the key elements so you can navigate effectively, even when surprises happen.
And they offer a tool for this, the negotiation navigation map. Seems like a structured way to prepare.
It is. It's quite practical. Think of it as having an inner core and an outer ring.
Okay, what's in the inner core?
That's about the immediate dynamics. The people involved, who are all the stakeholders, direct and indirect, and the relationships between them. Then the core interests yours and theirs. How you plan to communicate, verbal, vocal, visual strategy, and your initial options or ideas for potential outcomes.
Like a first pass at the key elements. Yeah. And the outer ring.
That provides the broader context and constraints. The independent criteria or objective standards you might use. Your walkaway alternatives, BTNA, MLTNA, MLNA, WATNA, your ultimate goals or aspirations, and your absolute bottom line.
So you look at the inner core, then check it against the outer ring factors.
Exactly. You might generate some initial options, then test them against your alternatives and goals. Do they hold up? Do you need to rethink? It's a way to ensure your preparation is comprehensive and realistic.
And underlying all this preparation is risk analysis, thinking about potential traps.
Yes, actively considering what could derail the negotiation and how you might counter common pitfalls. Preparation builds confidence and resilience.
So preparation sets the stage. But the negotiation itself is all about communication, isn't it? The sources call it larger-than-life communication.
I like that phrase, because in negotiation, everything sends a signal. Your words, your tone, your posture, your silences, it's all being interpreted.
There's that model mentioned, Schultz von Thun's 4 sides of a message.
Ah, yes. The idea that any statement carries multiple messages simultaneously. There's the factual informational content. There's the self-disclosure, what it says about the sender. There's the relationship aspect, how the sender views the receiver. And the appeal, what the sender wants the receiver to do or think.
The example they used about Tom and Mia discussing buying a house really showed that. The same words, "this house is expensive," could be heard as just a fact, or as Tom revealing he's worried about money, or as him implying Mia is being unrealistic, or as an appeal to look at cheaper houses.
Exactly. It highlights how easily misunderstandings can happen if the sender and receiver are focusing on different sides of the same message. We need awareness of all 4 channels, both speaking and listening.
And it's not just the words, the verbal, it's the vocal tone, pace, volume, and the visual body language appearance.
Absolutely. The sources talk about congruence. Do all these channels line up? When they don't, when someone says, "I'm fine," but their voice is tight and they won't make eye contact, we get that nagging feeling something's off.
Our subconscious picks up on the mismatch.
Often, yes. We might consciously craft our words, but our vocal tone or body language can betray our true feelings or intentions sometimes.
Which brings us to active listening. This seems critical. It's more than just not talking, right?
Way more. It's about genuinely trying to understand the other person's perspective, listening for the facts, the feelings, the underlying interests, paying attention to their verbal, vocal, and visual cues.
What are the benefits in a negotiation context?
Huge benefits. It builds rapport. People feel heard and respected. It helps you actually understand their position and interests more deeply. And it can uncover hidden issues or opportunities you might have missed.
The sources even mention consciously mirroring body language subtly to build rapport.
Yes, nonverbal synchrony can create a subconscious sense of connection. But it has to be subtle, obviously.
And active listening involves asking good questions, right? Clarifying questions.
Definitely. Questions focused on understanding the information, the request, the self-disclosure behind their statements, and also using reframing.
Reframing that sounds useful. What does that involve?
It's about changing the lens through which a statement is viewed. You could reframe a rigid position into an underlying interest. So, the reason you need that deadline is because. Or turn a negative complaint into a positive goal. Or take a general statement and ask for specifics. Or reframe a final demand as just one possible option among others.
It's a way to steer the conversation towards more productive ground.
Exactly. And using different types of questions, strategically open questions to explore, closed questions for specifics, probing questions to dig deeper, hypothetical questions to test possibilities, that's a key communication skill in negotiation.
Okay, but let's face it, negotiations aren't always calm and rational. Conflict and emotions often flare up.
Very true. The sources definitely acknowledge that. Conflict can trigger strong emotional responses, shut down communication, make the issues seem bigger or blurrier than they are, lead to rigid commitments, and just generally escalate things.
Understanding the type of conflict can help, apparently, like data, interest, relationship, value, structural conflicts.
Yes, knowing the root cause helps you address it more effectively. Is it a disagreement over facts, data, clashing needs, interest? A personality clash, relationship, differing core beliefs, value, or issues baked into the system, structural.
And the sources suggested you can sometimes reframe value conflicts, which are really hard to negotiate, into interest conflicts.
Yeah, sometimes. If you can find the underlying interests that are driving the value position, you might find more room to negotiate.
And there are different ways to respond to conflict too, right? Avoid, accommodate, compete, compromise, collaborate.
Those are the classic modes. The emphasis in constructive negotiation tends to be towards collaboration, or at least compromise, which requires understanding and acknowledging the other person's perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
And conflict isn't always bad. It can have upsides.
Surprisingly, yes. It can raise awareness of important issues, resolving it effectively can strengthen relationships, and navigating it can be a source of personal growth. It's about how you manage it.
The sources also touch on different negotiation styles, like conscientious, direct, cooperative, influencing. Is the idea just to know your own style?
Knowing your own style is the start, understanding its strengths and weaknesses, but also recognizing other styles and appreciating the value of diversity. A team with different styles might cover more bases and be more effective than a team where everyone thinks alike. Embrace difference.
Power dynamics also come up. It's not just about formal authority.
Not at all. Power in negotiation is relational and perceptual. It's about who seems to have more leverage or control in that specific interaction. The sources talk about moving beyond just asserting power towards using persuasion, understanding interests, and finding options that appeal to the other side.
And then there's this idea of multiple intelligences,
Yeah.
beyond just logical or linguistic intelligence.
Yeah, Howard Gardner's theory. People can be intelligent in different ways: musical, spatial, kinesthetic, interpersonal, understanding others, intrapersonal, understanding self, naturalist.
How does that relate to negotiation?
Well, self-awareness, intrapersonal, is key. Logical thinking helps analyze. Interpersonal helps read the room and build rapport. Understanding these different facets helps you appreciate diverse perspectives and maybe tailor your communication.
Seems linked to emotional intelligence, too.
Very much so. Emotional intelligence, understanding and managing your own emotions and recognizing and influencing others' emotions is critical. The sources mention improving it through mentalizing.
Mentalizing, what's that exactly?
It's basically the capacity to understand the mental state, the thoughts, feelings, intentions of oneself and others. It's like actively trying to step into their shoes and see the world and the negotiation from their perspective. deepens understanding immensely.
Fascinating. And this leads into the brain science part. The sources talk about the rational brain, the emotional brain, even the reptilian brain.
Yeah, the sort of triune brain model, the
Mhm.
prefrontal cortex for rational thought, the limbic system, especially the amygdala for emotions, and the brainstem for basic survival functions. Understanding their interplay helps explain why we react the way we do in negotiations.
The amygdala seems important, like an emotional gatekeeper.
It plays a huge role in processing threats and strong emotions, and it can sometimes hijack the rational brain, as we'll see.
And our brains have limits, right? Short-term memory.
Absolutely. We can only juggle so much information consciously at once, the famous magic number, around 7 items. Strategies like chunking information, taking notes, or focusing on key points can help manage this cognitive load. Mindfulness practice before negotiating can also help clear the mental clutter.
The power of storytelling came up here, too.
Yes, stories connect emotionally. They're more memorable than dry facts. They can build bridges and illustrate points powerfully.
Like the Nelson Mandela example mentioned.
A prime example. But the sources also warn against negative storytelling, casting yourself as the victim and them as the villain. That just deepens conflict.
And the idea that even rational thinking isn't purely rational, it's intertwined with emotion.
Completely. Our emotions influence our judgments and decisions far more than we often realize, which leads to the risk of
Emotional hijacking. The amygdala hijack.
exactly. That sudden, overwhelming emotional response anger, fear that bypasses your rational brain. You react before you think. The key is recognizing it and giving yourself time, sometimes 20 minutes or more, for the rational brain to come back online before responding.
Wow. And how we frame things matters hugely too, doesn't it? Loss aversion.
Yes, people are generally more motivated to avoid a loss than to achieve an equivalent gain. How you frame a proposal highlighting potential losses versus potential gains can significantly impact how it's received.
Anchoring comes up again here, and even the power of the word free.
All examples of cognitive biases that influence decision-making. Being aware of them helps you use framing ethically and recognize when it might be used on you.
And it's not just about the economics. Fairness and integrity matter.
Deeply. People will often reject deals they perceive as unfair, even if it's economically irrational to do so. Trust and perceived integrity are crucial.
The sources also mention meta-emotions, feeling about feelings.
Yeah, like feeling guilty about being angry or embarrassed about feeling anxious. Understanding your own meta-emotions and trying to understand others adds another layer to emotional intelligence.
So managing your own emotions during a negotiation, what's the advice?
Acknowledge the emotion non-judgmentally. Try to understand its trigger, mentalize. Accept that it's there. Then choose an appropriate way to communicate or manage it. Maybe take a break, reframe the situation, use calming techniques, find what works for you.
Okay, so we've covered strategies, preparation, communication, emotions. But negotiations don't happen in a vacuum. Culture, sex, gender, these all play a role.
Absolutely. The sources stress the need for fluency awareness in these areas. Cultural fluency starts with understanding your own cultural starting points and biases, then developing curiosity about others.
They contrasted, like Eastern holistic thinking with Western analytical thinking, high context versus low context communication.
Yes, and they offered dimensions to consider, like individualism versus communitarianism, how time is viewed, sequential versus synchronous, universal rules versus particular relationships. It's not about stereotyping, but about being aware of potential differences in approach and values.
The goal is curiosity, not judgment. The example of that Australian-Chinese negotiation failure really drove home the cost of lacking that fluency.
It did. And similarly with sex and gender. The sources touch on ongoing research about potential neurological differences, empathy studies, and how performance can vary based on the situation's ambiguity.
And how stereotypes can actually be activated and influence outcomes, like priming effects.
Yes, just mentioning a stereotype beforehand can sometimes create a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's complex and sensitive territory.
The Ellen Pao example at Reddit, eliminating salary negotiation to address potential gender pay gaps, shows how organizations are grappling with this.
And the final piece here is intersectional fluency, recognizing that people hold multiple identities, culture, gender, race, class, etc., and these intersect in complex ways to shape their experiences and how they might approach negotiation.
It's about seeing the whole person and the complex factors influencing them.
Exactly. Increased awareness is key.
Now, what about when things get tough? Hardball tactics and impasses. People do use manipulative tactics sometimes.
They do. Reasons vary. Maybe they think it gives them an edge. Maybe it's about reputation. Maybe they just don't know another way. The sources list ones: good cop, bad cop, threats, pressure tactics, deliberate deception.
So how do you deal with them? The sources suggested ignoring them sometimes.
That's one option, especially if it's minor. But a more robust approach is often described as name it and disarm it. You recognize the tactic being used. You raise it explicitly. I notice you seem to be using a pressure tactic here. You question its legitimacy or usefulness. Is that really going to help us find a solution? And then you suggest negotiating the process itself, agreeing to more constructive rules of engagement.
Takes confidence, but seems powerful. And some tactics are just out of bounds, right? Unethical or illegal.
Absolutely. Things like negotiating in bad faith with no real intention of reaching agreement or engaging in misleading and deceptive conduct can have serious legal consequences, depending on the jurisdiction.
And there are common traps negotiators fall into, even without hardball tactics.
Yes, the sources list several. The pacing trap, feeling rushed. The predictability trap, being too easy to read. Overconfidence, being swayed by framing. The sunk cost trap.
Ah, the sunk cost trap. Feeling you have to stick with something just because you've already invested time or money, even if it's no longer the best path.
Precisely. Recognizing these traps is the first step to avoiding them.
And if you just get stuck,
Mm.
an impasse, what then?
Several strategies. Change the issue, maybe tackle something easier first, or bundle issues differently. Change the process, take a break. Change the venue, bring in new information. Work on the relationship dynamic, make a different kind of offer. Try to shift perceptions of fairness or principles. Use ambiguity strategically, or consider bringing in a third party, like a mediator.
What about wicked problems, those really complex, tangled issues?
Those require a different level of engagement. They often involve multiple stakeholders with fundamentally different views of reality. You need deep understanding of those underlying perspectives and a willingness to experiment with potential solutions, knowing there's no single right answer.
And often, negotiations involve more than two people. Multi-party negotiations add complexity.
Oh, definitely. Strategic complexity, more players, potential coalitions, informational complexity, who knows what, procedural complexity, how do you manage the conversation,
Yeah.
and relationship complexity, more potential friction points.
The sources talked about different roles people take in groups: task-focused, relationship-focused, self-focused.
Yeah, recognizing those roles can help manage group dynamics. And crucially, in multi-party settings, you need to consider the Bayesian of all the key players, not just your own.
So how do you manage these larger groups?
Strategies include appointing a facilitator or chairperson, setting clear ground rules and an agenda, managing communication flow, maybe using a speaker list or structured techniques, explicit brainstorming sessions, maybe using the nominal group technique to gather ideas individually first, or aiming for agreement on smaller issues initially to build momentum.
The Johari window model came up too about self-awareness and group awareness.
Right. Understanding what's known to self, known to others, hidden and unknown. The goal in constructive negotiation is often to enlarge the open quadrant, shared knowledge and understanding by appropriate self-disclosure and seeking feedback.
And negotiating as a team. Pros and cons.
Opportunities include broader expertise, more capacity for information gathering, potential for synergy. Risks include internal disagreements, pressure for premature consensus, difficulty integrating different views, or conflicting interests within the team itself. Strategic team selection and internal coordination are vital.
Wow, okay, that was a genuine deep dive. We've covered a huge amount. To try and crystallize it for you, the listener, the sources offer some core principles for constructive negotiation.
They're like guiding lights. Prepare, prepare, prepare. Be firm on your interests, but flexible on how they're met. Be friendly, be fair. Listen actively with those 4 ears we talked about, and speak clearly with the 4 tongues.
Use your multiple intelligences, develop that cultural and intersectional fluency, know your walkaway alternatives inside out, always negotiate ethically.
Focus on interests, not just positions. Look for ways to create value before you start claiming it. Show care and build rapport, but maybe don't reveal everything. Instantly be strategically open and closed.
Manage distrust actively and work to build trust. And remember, even in an interest-based world, sometimes you need those positional skills for specific issues.
It really underscores that negotiation isn't a simple formula. It's multidimensional, it's dynamic, it requires constant awareness, reflection, and adaptation.
Absolutely. So as you go back over your own experiences, think about these concepts. Where do you see them playing out? What could you try differently next time?
And maybe a final thought to chew on. How can you cultivate that genuine curiosity about the other side's world, their needs and constraints, even while you're advocating strongly for your own? How do you hold both of those things simultaneously to find truly creative, lasting solutions?
Something to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us today.